The world is watching closely as an unprecedented financial experiment unfolds across the African continent, one that could shake the very foundation of the global economic order. The question on everyone's mind is simple yet profound. Is China's Africa payment plan a game changer for the dollar? Or is it simply another short-lived challenge to the long-standing dominance of the United States currency? To understand the magnitude of this development, we must look not only at the surface level of economics and trade, but also at the deeper layers of history, geopolitics, and the shifting balance of power in a multipolar world that is emerging before our very eyes. For over 7 decades, the United States dollar has stood as the backbone of international commerce, the reserve currency of choice for governments, and the measuring stick for commodities from oil to gold. Nations across the globe have been compelled to transact in dollars, regardless of whether the United States was involved in their trade. This reality gave Washington not only enormous economic leverage, but also unparalleled political power. Sanctions, access to global banking, credit, and debt negotiations have all been wielded with the dollar as a weapon and a shield. But the rise of China as the world's second-largest economy, the dissatisfaction of the global South with Western financial institutions, and the steady erosion of trust in a dollar-dominated order have all converged to create an opening. Into this opening, Beijing has stepped with boldness, offering Africa something radically different, a payment system that bypasses the dollar altogether. This is not a sudden development. China has spent decades cultivating its presence in Africa. Infrastructure projects, soft loans, development partnerships, and trade ties have created a dense web of interdependence. Roads, railways, bridges, power plants, and ports across the continent now stand as physical evidence of this relationship. Yet for all of this, the dollar remained the final arbiter of value. Even Chinese loans and African repayments were often denominated in U.S. currency. Now, however, Beijing is pushing for change. The proposal is simple in form, yet revolutionary in consequence. Allow African nations to settle their trade, debts, and investments directly in yuan or through a digital payment system linked to China's central bank, bypassing the Western-dominated financial system altogether. The timing could not be more significant. Across Africa, frustration with international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, has been mounting. These institutions, often accused of imposing harsh structural adjustment policies and keeping nations in cycles of dependency, are losing legitimacy. At the same time, Africa's leaders are seeking new avenues to assert sovereignty and gain greater control over their economic futures. With the dollar still dominant but increasingly questioned, the idea of an alternative resonates powerfully. For China, this is not simply about convenience in trade. It is about strategically undermining the monopoly of the dollar and expanding the global footprint of the yuan. Consider the mechanics. Today, if Nigeria wants to buy machinery from China, the transaction typically flows through the US dollar. Nigerian banks convert naira into dollars, which are then exchanged for yuan. This not only increases costs, but also exposes the transaction to American oversight and potential sanctions. Under China's proposed plan, Nigerian businesses could settle directly in yuan or through a China-backed digital currency platform. This cuts out the middleman, reduces transaction costs, and most importantly, weakens the necessity of the dollar. Multiply this scenario across dozens of African nations, from resource-rich Angola to manufacturing-driven Ethiopia, and the implications are clear. A gradual but significant erosion of dollar dominance in one of the fastest-growing regions of the world. Skeptics may ask whether Africa's adoption of yuan-based trade or digital payment systems can really challenge the global supremacy of the dollar. After all, the greenback is not just a currency. It is an institution backed by deep financial markets, military power, and global trust. But history shows us that no currency reigns forever. The British pound sterling once dominated the world, supported by the empire's global reach. Yet it ceded its role after 2 world wars, economic crises, and the rise of America. Today, the same forces of geopolitical realignment and economic transformation are at work. China is the largest trading partner for most African nations. If trade is already centered around Beijing, why should payments not reflect that reality? The deeper issue is not just about currency choice, but about sovereignty. For decades, African economies have been tied to Western financial systems that dictate terms of access and impose restrictions. By offering an alternative, China presents itself as a liberator, a partner willing to engage on different terms. But here lies the paradox. While African leaders may welcome independence from the dollar, many also fear dependency on another external power. Will Beijing simply replace Washington as the gatekeeper of global finance? Or will this truly open up new pathways for African autonomy? The answer is complex, and it rests on how Africa navigates this moment. China's strategy is multi-pronged. The Belt and Road Initiative has already laid the groundwork for deep connectivity. The use of yuan in trade settlement is being encouraged not only in Africa, but across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Simultaneously, China has pioneered the digital yuan, a central bank digital currency that allows instantaneous cross-border transactions outside the control of Western banks. If African nations adopt this technology, it could accelerate a financial shift on a scale not seen since the Bretton Woods system was created after World War II. And that is precisely why Washington is alarmed. For the United States, the dollar's dominance is not just about prestige, it is about power. It gives America the ability to borrow cheaply, sanction adversaries, and project influence without firing a shot. A serious challenge to the dollar threatens this foundation. That is why policymakers, economists, and strategists in Washington are monitoring China's Africa payment plan with concern. Some warn of a yuan zone emerging in Africa that could one day rival the dollar system. Others argue that Africa's weak financial institutions, political instability, and lack of infrastructure will prevent such a shift from becoming meaningful. But dismissing this development as inconsequential would be a mistake. History often turns on seemingly small pivots, and the symbolic weight of entire nations rejecting the dollar is not to be underestimated. The potential benefits for Africa are clear. Reduced transaction costs, insulation from American sanctions, diversification of currency risk, and closer alignment with their largest trading partner. Yet risks abound. What happens if African economies peg themselves too tightly to the yuan, only to find Beijing using that leverage for political purposes? What if the digital infrastructure provided by China creates new vulnerabilities, such as surveillance or lack of transparency? What if the yuan itself, still not fully convertible and backed by a relatively closed financial system, fails to provide the stability Africa seeks? These questions reveal the complexity of the issue. Beyond the technicalities of finance, this story is also about symbolism and narrative. Across Africa, leaders are presenting this move as part of a broader rebellion against neo-colonial control. The dollar has come to symbolize not just a currency, but the weight of Western dominance. Choosing an alternative is therefore a political act, a declaration of independence. China, with its rhetoric of South-South cooperation and non-interference, has positioned itself as the partner of choice for this new era. Whether reality will match the rhetoric remains to be seen, but the narrative itself carries tremendous power. The ripple effects extend beyond Africa. If successful, China's Africa payment plan could serve as a model for other regions. Latin America, long dependent on the dollar, is already exploring alternatives. The Middle East, where energy trade dominates, has seen whispers of oil being priced in yuan. Even in Asia, U.S. allies are hedging their bets, expanding their use of local currencies in bilateral trade. Each step may seem small, but together they paint a picture of a world moving slowly but surely toward a multipolar currency system. None of this means the dollar will disappear overnight. The depth of American financial markets, the strength of its institutions, and the global trust built over decades remain formidable. But dominance is not the same as monopoly. The dollar may retain its primacy while losing its exclusivity. And that, for Washington, would be a seismic shift. Power would be shared, not monopolized. Influence would be contested, not guaranteed. In such a world, Africa's embrace of China's payment system could be remembered as one of the key turning points. This development also raises profound questions for ordinary Africans. Will the shift to yuan-based trade bring down the price of goods, make credit more accessible, or reduce the burden of debt? Will it empower local businesses and create jobs, or will it simply create new dependencies? The answers will depend not only on China's intentions, but also on the governance choices of African nations themselves. Strong leadership, transparent policies, and careful balancing will be needed to ensure that this new opportunity does not turn into a new trap. None of this means the dollar will disappear overnight. The depth of American financial markets, the strength of its institutions, and the global trust built over decades remain formidable. But dominance is not the same as monopoly. The dollar may retain its primacy while losing its exclusivity, and that, for Washington, would be a seismic shift. Power would be shared, not monopolized. Influence would be contested, not guaranteed. In such a world, Africa's embrace of China's payment system could be remembered as one of the key turning points. This development also raises profound questions for ordinary Africans. Will the shift to yuan-based trade bring down the price of goods, make credit more accessible, or reduce the burden of debt? Will it empower local businesses and create jobs, or will it simply create new dependencies? The answers will depend not only on China's intentions, but also on the governance choices of African nations themselves. Strong leadership, transparent policies, and careful balancing will be needed to ensure that this new opportunity does not turn into a new trap. Ultimately, the significance of China's Africa payment plan lies not only in its financial implications, but in its symbolic resonance. It is a challenge to a system that has seemed unshakable for generations. It is a statement that alternatives are possible, that the global South need not always play by the rules set in Washington or Brussels. Whether this experiment succeeds or fails, it marks the beginning of a new chapter in the story of global finance. A chapter in which Africa is no longer just a passive participant, but an active stage upon which the drama of a changing world order is unfolding. So, is China's Africa payment plan a game changer for the dollar? The answer depends on what we mean by a game changer. If we mean the immediate collapse of dollar dominance, then no, the dollar remains entrenched. But if we mean the slow, steady erosion of monopoly power, the creation of viable alternatives, and the psychological shift that comes when nations believe they have a choice, then the answer is yes. Because every time a trade is settled in yuan instead of dollars, every time a leader in Africa or elsewhere publicly endorses alternatives, the symbolic hold of the dollar weakens. And history teaches us that change often begins not with sudden collapse, but with gradual erosion. Just as the pound gave way to the dollar may one day share its throne or even relinquish it. When that day comes, historians may look back and say that the seeds were planted not in Washington or Beijing, but in the ports, markets, and ministries of Africa, where leaders dared to experiment with a different path. The story is far from over. What we are witnessing is not the end of the dollar, but the beginning of something new, uncertain, and deeply consequential. A world where financial power is contested, where alternatives are real, and where Africa stands at the center of a global transformation. That is why China's Africa payment plan matters. That is why it may indeed be remembered as a game changer. And that is why the entire world is paying attention.